The story of a gladiator's life did not begin in the arena with the roar of the crowd. It began long before, often in the shadows of defeat, humiliation, or desperation. In the Roman imagination, the gladiator symbolized both the lowest of the low and the embodiment of courage, discipline, and spectacle. Yet the path to becoming one of these fighters was rarely one of choice and glory. For many, it began with chains. After Rome expanded across the Mediterranean, prisoners of war were among the primary sources of new gladiators. Defeated Gauls, Thracians, and Germans found themselves paraded through the streets of Rome as living trophies of conquest. Once the triumph was over, many of these captives were sold to the ludi, the gladiator schools. They were not asked if they wished to fight, their destiny was written for them in the blood-stained sands of the amphitheater. These men carried with them not only the trauma of defeat but also the stigma of being forced into a profession that Romans themselves considered dishonorable. Another wellspring of gladiators came from Rome's criminal underclass. Those convicted of serious crimes such as theft, murder, or rebellion could be condemned to the arena as punishment. These damnati ad gladium, literally, condemned to the sword, were not given the chance to negotiate their role. They were marked for the most dangerous fights, the ones where survival was least likely. To the Roman public, their deaths were not tragic, they were justice performed as entertainment. In this way, the arena served as both a stage and an execution ground, blurring the line between spectacle and state punishment. Debt, too, could pull a man into gladiatorial life. Rome was an unforgiving society when it came to financial obligations, and those who could not pay often faced enslavement. For some, the gladiator school offered a grim solution: sign away their freedom in exchange for shelter, food, and the slim hope of earning enough to one day buy it back. These contractual gladiators were called auctorati. Unlike the prisoners or criminals, they were volunteers in name, though desperation rather than ambition usually drove their choice. Their contracts were legally binding, often sealed with an oath to endure burning, chains, whipping, or death by the sword. It was less a declaration of courage and more a resignation to suffering. Yet not every man who entered the arena did so under duress. A small but significant number of gladiators joined willingly, not because they were cornered by debt or condemned by the courts, but because the lure of glory and the promise of reward was too strong to resist. The paradox of Roman society was that gladiators, though considered infames, outside the bounds of civic honor, were also objects of enormous fascination. They were celebrated in graffiti scrawled across Pompeii's walls, adored by women who sent them love notes, and even courted by politicians eager to harness their fame. For some freeborn men, particularly those of lower status who felt invisible in the rigid hierarchy of Rome, becoming a gladiator was a way to carve out an identity, however dangerous. These men, the true volunteers, joined not from desperation but from the hope that the amphitheater could make them immortal. The recruitment of gladiators was a business in itself, overseen by the lanisti, the managers and trainers of the gladiator schools. To the elite classes, a lanista was a distasteful figure, profiting from human misery, yet his services were essential to the empire's most popular form of mass entertainment. Lanisti bought and sold gladiators like commodities, selecting men based on physical strength, endurance, or simply availability. They invested money in these fighters, paying for their training and upkeep, but expected blood and profit in return. To the lanista, a gladiator was both a performer and an asset. A strong, long-lasting fighter could be worth far more alive than dead. The origins of gladiatorial combat itself added an eerie weight to this recruitment process. The first gladiatorial games were not staged for entertainment alone but as funeral rituals. When a wealthy Roman aristocrat died, his heirs sometimes honored his memory by organizing combat between slaves at his funeral, a grim sacrifice meant to appease the spirits. Over time, these rituals detached from funerary practice and grew into spectacles in their own right. What began as acts of private mourning became massive public entertainments, held in amphitheaters that could seat tens of thousands. By the time of the empire, the recruitment of gladiators had become an institutionalized system, no longer tied to individual deaths but to the city's hunger for blood and distraction. The paradox of the gladiator's origin is perhaps best captured in the story of Spartacus. A Thracian soldier captured by Rome, he was sold into slavery and forced into a gladiator school in Capua. There, alongside dozens of others, he endured the daily humiliations of training, only to eventually lead a revolt that shook the empire itself. His story is often romanticized as one of freedom and defiance, but beneath the legend lies the reality of countless men who shared his fate but lacked his charisma or his luck. For every Spartacus, there were hundreds whose names were lost to history, swallowed by the sand and forgotten by the crowd. The backgrounds of gladiators were therefore as diverse as the empire itself. In the same barracks, you might find a captured Gallic warrior who once led men into battle, a Roman thief condemned for his crimes, a poor farmer who had signed away his freedom for a handful of coins, and a volunteer lured by the promise of fame. They came from different worlds, but once inside the school they shared the same chains, the same training, and the same looming prospect of death. What is most shocking is how normalized this system became in Roman life. To modern eyes, the forced recruitment of prisoners and criminals into deadly combat seems barbaric, but for Romans it was part of the fabric of society. The empire ran on conquest, slavery, and spectacle, and the gladiator was the perfect embodiment of all three. Every man who entered the arena, whether by force, desperation, or choice, carried with him the weight of this system, becoming both victim and instrument of Rome's obsession with control and display. Thus, the birth of a gladiator was rarely heroic. It was a story of capture, coercion, or compromise, wrapped in the glittering promise of spectacle. For some it meant a chance at redemption, for others a descent into degradation, and for a very few, the slim hope of immortality. But whatever the path, once the oath was sworn and the gates of the gladiator school closed behind them, their fate was sealed. They were no longer free men. They were gladiators, living sacrifices to the hunger of the Roman crowd. The gladiator's journey did not end with recruitment, in truth, it only began there. Once a man was purchased, condemned, or volunteered, he was taken to the ludus, the gladiator school, where the transformation from ordinary man to fighting machine would begin. To the Romans, these schools were both training grounds and prisons, places where men were broken down and rebuilt into tools of spectacle. The most famous of these was the Ludus Magnus in Rome, a vast complex connected directly to the Colosseum by an underground passageway. But every major city across the empire had its own schools, each one part barracks, part dungeon, part gymnasium, and part theater rehearsal hall. Life in the ludus was rigid and unforgiving. Gladiators were placed under the absolute authority of the lanista, the school owner, who controlled every aspect of their existence. To the outside world, a lanista was considered morally suspect, someone who trafficked in blood. But within the walls of the school, he was a businessman, investing heavily in his fighters and expecting returns in the form of successful performances in the arena. A gladiator was not free to leave, nor to disobey. If he resisted training, he was flogged. If he tried to escape, he faced chains, mutilation, or death. Discipline was the first lesson learned, and it was enforced with brutality. Each day followed a strict routine. Gladiators awoke in cramped barracks, often sharing a cell-like room with another fighter. The quarters were sparse, straw bedding, a few personal items, and little else. Privacy did not exist. Surveillance was constant, for the lanista knew that men condemned to death were often men desperate for rebellion. The walls of the school were high, the gates locked, and guards stood ready to suppress any attempt at freedom. The atmosphere was one of containment. Even in their off hours, gladiators remained under watch. From dawn until dusk, the fighters trained under the guidance of instructors known as doctors. Many of these were retired gladiators themselves, men who had survived enough battles to live out their later years teaching the next generation. To the trainees, they were both mentors and tormentors. They pushed the recruits through endless drills, teaching them not only how to wield a sword or shield but also how to perform before a crowd. Every movement was scrutinized, the angle of a thrust, the timing of a parry, the posture held after striking a blow. Combat was not simply survival, it was choreography, designed to thrill the spectators who demanded both skill and spectacle. The school specialized in different types of fighters. A new recruit would be evaluated, his physique studied, his temperament tested, and then he would be assigned to a particular gladiator class. A tall, broad man might be trained as a murmillo, carrying a heavy shield and short sword. A nimble, quick recruit might be molded into a retiarius, armed with only a net and trident. Others would become secutors, threses, or hoplomachi, each with their distinctive weapons and armor. The lanista and doctors matched recruits not only to their natural abilities but also to the needs of the games. The Roman crowd loved contrast, heavy versus light, brute force versus agility, shield versus net. Every pairing was designed to maximize drama. Weapons in training were rarely sharp. Instead, wooden swords called rudis were used for drills, their weight heavier than real weapons to build strength and endurance. Shields were weighted too, forcing the fighters to develop stamina that would serve them in the arena. Day after day, they practiced under the harsh sun, sweating, bleeding, and straining as instructors barked orders. Mistakes were punished with lashes, but excellence was sometimes rewarded with extra rations or privileges. Carrots and sticks were both used, for the lanista knew that fear alone could break a man before he ever reached the arena. Food in the school was carefully rationed. Gladiators ate a diet designed not for pleasure but for performance. Their meals were rich in barley, beans, and simple porridge, meant to build mass rather than speed. They drank infusions of vinegar and ash, believed to strengthen bones. To the outsider, it seemed a humble diet, yet it was calculated to turn lean men into bulky, resilient fighters whose bodies could withstand blows and still rise again. Despite the strict discipline, gladiators were investments worth protecting. When injuries occurred in training, doctors attached to the school treated them with surprising care. Broken bones were set, wounds stitched, herbal remedies applied. The lanista had spent money acquiring each man, and every coin invested in their upkeep promised larger profits in the future. In this paradox, gladiators were both slaves and valuable property. They were degraded and controlled, yet kept alive and trained with a meticulousness most ordinary laborers could never imagine. Psychological conditioning was as important as physical training. Gladiators were constantly reminded of their fate, death was always close, and survival depended on obedience. New recruits swore an oath upon entering the school, to endure burning, chains, flogging, or death by the sword. This oath was not ceremonial, it was a declaration of absolute submission. The lanista demanded not just compliance but identity. Once the oath was sworn, the man ceased to be himself and became property of the arena. And yet, within the walls of the school, strange bonds formed. Men who might once have been enemies, Gauls captured in war, Greeks sold into slavery, Romans condemned by the courts, now trained side by side. They fought each other in sparring matches, but they also shared the same rations, the same barracks, the same fear. Some forged friendships, others rivalries, but all were united by the grim certainty that one day they would walk into the amphitheater and face death together or against one another. The school stripped them of their pasts but created a new brotherhood of the condemned. The Ludus Magnus in Rome could house hundreds of gladiators at once. Archaeological remains show a massive rectangular building, with a central training yard surrounded by tiers of cells. Above, balconies allowed overseers to watch the drills below. Underground passages connected directly to the Colosseum, so fighters could be marched unseen from their barracks to the grandest stage of all. The very architecture was designed to control and contain. Every corridor, every locked door, reminded the gladiators that they were prisoners whose only chance at release lay through bloodshed and spectacle. For the recruit, daily life in the gladiator school was a mixture of fear, exhaustion, and anticipation. Some longed for the day they might step into the arena, believing that survival and victory could bring rewards or even freedom. Others dreaded it, knowing that the odds were stacked against them. But there was no choice. The moment they swore their oath and crossed the threshold of the ludus, their lives were no longer their own. They belonged to the lanista, to the crowd, and ultimately to the sands of the amphitheater. The transformation of a man into a gladiator reached its sharpest edge in the training yard. The school was not just a prison and not just a barracks, it was a forge, and the men inside were hammered into weapons. The endless drills, the punishing routines, all had one purpose: to prepare fighters for blood and sand. But training was more than learning how to kill. It was about learning how to perform. Each recruit, once assigned his gladiator type, entered a specialized regime that would define his life and death in the arena. The Romans loved variety, and so the Lanisti developed a dazzling array of combat classes. The heavily armored Mirmillo, with his broad shield and gladius, was trained to embody the image of brute strength. His traditional opponent was the retiarius, lightly armed with only a trident, a dagger, and a net, his body exposed and vulnerable but his movements agile and unpredictable. The secutor, designed specifically to chase and counter the net fighter, wore a helmet with narrow eye holes to prevent entanglement. The Thraex carried a curved sword, the Dymacharis fought with two blades, and others carried long spears or small bucklers. Every pairing was calculated for maximum drama: the clash of styles, the contrast of appearance, the suspense of unequal weapons. The Romans wanted theater as much as slaughter. But the truth hidden behind the spectacle is that gladiatorial combat was not a chaotic free-for-all. It was rehearsed, drilled, and structured to keep the audience entertained. Training mimicked real combat, but it was also stagecraft. Gladiators practiced their roles the way an actor learns his lines. A retiarius was trained to circle, to strike with speed, to throw his net with flair, and to play up his vulnerability when cornered. A Mirmillo was taught to advance with measured steps, shield high, pressing his bulk like an unstoppable force. The fight, when it finally played out in the arena, was as much performance as violence. Weapons in the training yard were deliberately heavier than those used in combat. Wooden swords, iron weights, and shields reinforced with lead forced the fighters to build endurance. A man who could spar for hours with a practice gladius would find the real weapon light and swift in his hands when the time came to fight for his life. These drills were grueling, endless repetitions under the harsh sun. The men struck at wooden posts, learning to target vital areas of the body. They practiced footwork over sand and gravel, building balance and stamina. A gladiator's body was honed into a machine, capable not only of delivering blows but of sustaining them. Beyond technique, fighters were taught discipline of mind. The Romans understood that fear could break even the strongest man. Doctors and Lanisti alike reinforced the oath sworn at the beginning of training, to endure burning, whipping, and the sword. A gladiator who flinched, who turned his head at the sight of a blade, risked punishment. They were trained to accept pain, to fight even when bleeding, to keep their eyes forward no matter what. The crowd demanded courage, and so the school drilled courage into them. The sparring matches were crucial. Within the confines of the training yard, gladiators fought under the watchful eyes of their doctors, perfecting both skill and showmanship. These fights were not to the death, but they were dangerous. Wooden weapons could still break bones, and mistakes could be punished with blood. But the purpose was not only practice. These matches also allowed the lanista to judge his fighters, to see who would draw the crowd, who might become a star, and who was destined to be little more than fodder in the arena. The fighters knew this. Every training bout was a test, a chance to prove themselves worthy of better matches, better treatment, perhaps even fame. The strategy of the arena was just as important as brute skill. A Mirmillo had to conserve his strength, waiting for the lighter retiarius to tire. A Thraex had to press constantly, never letting the opponent find space. Even the most basic moves, how to fall, how to stand, how to face the crowd, were drilled again and again. A gladiator who collapsed in fear or stumbled awkwardly lost more than the fight. he lost the respect of the audience, and that could mean the difference between life and death if the final decision rested on the crowd's will. What might surprise modern audiences is that many of these fights, though bloody, were not intended to be one-sided massacres. A dead gladiator was a lost investment. For the lanista, the goal was to create drama without necessarily destroying the product. This meant fights that pushed men to their limits, showcasing skill and endurance, but sometimes ended with mercy granted to the defeated. The training reflected this balance. Gladiators were prepared to fight fiercely but also taught how to yield with dignity if overpowered, presenting themselves as worthy adversaries deserving of survival. Still, death was always present. Every drill, every sparring match reminded the gladiators that their training was not just for sport but for survival. A single mistake in the arena could mean death at the tip of a blade. The psychological weight was enormous. Men trained side by side knowing they might one day face each other in front of tens of thousands of screaming spectators. Trust and rivalry blurred. Bonds were real, but so was the knowledge that brother might be pitted against brother for the crowd's amusement. In the grand amphitheaters of Rome, the results of this training became clear. Fighters did not simply stumble into battle, they entered the sand prepared, polished, and hardened. They knew how to move with grace, how to attack with precision, and how to endure with theatrical courage. The cheers of the audience were not only for the blood spilled but for the spectacle of mastery. Every thrust, every parry, every desperate dodge was the product of months or even years of drilling in the dust of the ludus. To the Roman public, these men seemed like natural-born warriors, gladiators destined for bloodshed. But the truth was harsher and stranger. Gladiators were manufactured. They were shaped, molded, rehearsed, and perfected by a system that turned prisoners, slaves, and desperate volunteers into living actors in a theater of death. Their skill was real, their pain genuine, but behind the chaos of the arena lay the strict discipline of the school, where every move had been practiced, every blow anticipated. And so, when the gates of the amphitheater opened and the crowd roared, the gladiators were not improvising. They were performing roles written in sweat, blood, and fear long before the fight began. They were men turned into instruments of spectacle, honed in the training yard, ready to bleed for an audience that demanded both death and drama. When we imagine a gladiator, we picture a warrior built on meat and wine, a feasting brute who dined like a soldier before battle. But the truth is far more surprising, and perhaps more shocking. The diet of Rome's gladiators was not one of indulgence or luxury, but of calculation. These men, destined to fight and bleed for entertainment, were fed not for pleasure but for performance. Their meals were designed to build bulk, to provide endurance, and to keep them alive long enough to thrill the crowd. Ancient sources refer to gladiators as horderii, the barley men. This nickname was no accident. Far from the heavy meat-eating warriors of popular imagination, gladiators consumed vast amounts of barley, beans, and other legumes. Their diet was overwhelmingly plant-based, high in carbohydrates and low in animal protein. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Excavations at gladiator cemeteries in places like Ephesus reveal bones dense with minerals consistent with a vegetarian or semi-vegetarian diet. Barley was the staple, boiled into porridge, baked into bread, or mixed into gruel. Beans provided protein, though not in the amounts one might expect for men expected to fight with swords. Fruits and vegetables supplemented their meals, while meat was a rarity. This was not because Rome lacked access to livestock. Wealthy citizens dined on pork, beef, and exotic game regularly, but because meat was expensive, and gladiators were commodities managed for profit. Feeding them on cheap, filling, plant-based staples made economic sense. But there was a deeper logic to this diet. Gladiators were not trained to be lean and swift like athletes of today. Instead, they were deliberately bulked up, their bodies padded with fat. To the Roman crowd, this made sense. A well-fed fighter not only looked impressive but could also absorb more superficial wounds without dying too quickly. Fat layered over muscle created a kind of natural armor. A cut through skin and fat produced blood, pleasing the spectators, without immediately threatening the fighter's life. A lean, wiry man might be agile, but he risked being killed with a single deep cut. A bulkier gladiator could bleed dramatically while enduring longer, keeping the fight exciting and prolonging the spectacle. And so, their diet supported this theatrical physiology. Barley and beans packed en masse, while supplements ensured that bones and joints could withstand punishment. One of the most unusual details comes from the writings of Galen, the physician who once served at a gladiator school in Pergamum. He noted that gladiators drank a tonic made from plant ashes mixed with vinegar, creating a chalky solution rich in calcium. It was a crude but effective way of strengthening bones, ensuring fighters could survive the repeated blows of wooden practice swords and the brutal clashes of real combat. Modern studies of gladiator remains confirm this practice. Their bones contained unusually high mineral content, evidence of deliberate supplementation. For many recruits, especially those from regions where diets were more diverse, this regimented menu was a shock. Imagine a Thracian warrior captured in battle, used to eating roasted meat and drinking fermented drinks, suddenly reduced to endless bowls of barley gruel. Food was no longer about culture or pleasure, it was fuel. Meals were communal, simple, and repetitive. The gladiators ate together under guard, stripped of any freedom of choice. Their meals reminded them daily that they were not men of status but property, sustained on the cheapest fuel available. Yet, ironically, this humble diet may have kept them healthier than many free citizens of Rome. The common urban poor often survived on bread alone, lacking the beans, vegetables, and supplements that the gladiators received. The lanista had an interest in keeping his fighters well-fed, for a malnourished gladiator was a wasted investment. The irony is sharp: men condemned to die were sometimes better nourished than the free masses who paid to watch them fight. The diet also carried psychological weight. To be fed like livestock, on barley and beans, reminded the gladiators of their place. They were not citizens dining on roasted meats and fine wines. They were tools, kept alive with gruel, fortified not for comfort but for combat. Eating became another layer of control, another reminder that their bodies belonged not to themselves but to the spectacle. There are scattered reports of exceptions, occasional feasts before major games, where gladiators might be paraded at banquets, displayed before wealthy patrons, or offered richer foods as part of the ceremony. But these moments were rare, designed more as theater than sustenance. Day to day, the gladiator's bowl returned to barley, beans, and ash, the monotonous fuel of survival. The nickname "barley men" might have sounded mocking, but in truth it defined the essence of their existence. Their food was plain, their meals repetitive, their bodies sculpted not for health or happiness but for endurance and display. The Romans marveled at their size, their strength, their ability to fight on through wounds, but behind this spectacle lay the unglamorous truth: it was the diet of slaves, designed to maximize utility and minimize cost. In the end, the gladiator's diet was as carefully constructed as his training. Every spoonful of barley gruel was another reminder that his body was not his own. Every sip of ash tonic was a preparation for the punishment to come. And when the crowd roared at the sight of blood spilling across the sand, they were applauding not just the courage of the man in the arena but also the invisible system of control that had fed him, trained him, and turned him into a creature designed for spectacle. The gladiator's body was the product of calculation, and his food, humble, repetitive, and unappetizing, was as much a part of the theater as the sword he carried. Gladiatorial combat was designed to entertain, but beneath the roar of the crowd lay a world of agony. Every strike, every fall, every clash of steel carried a price paid not only in blood but in broken bones, torn flesh, and the silent suffering that followed once the gates of the arena closed. If the gladiator schools were forges of spectacle, then they were also clinics of survival. Pain was inevitable. Medicine was essential. And in this strange world, the most despised slaves sometimes received medical care more advanced than what many free Romans could ever dream of. The toll on the body was relentless. Training itself caused injuries. Wooden practice swords, heavier than real blades, left bruises that spread across the skin like purple maps of punishment. Sprains, dislocated shoulders, fractured ribs, these were common before a gladiator ever faced a real opponent. In the arena, wounds multiplied. Swords slashed skin and muscle, tridents punctured organs, nets dragged men to the ground where bones cracked against stone. Even when a fight ended in mercy, the victor often limped away bleeding, battered, or scarred. Yet unlike the countless slaves who labored in fields or mines with little hope of care, gladiators were treated. Their value demanded it. A lanista who had invested heavily in training a fighter would not throw away his asset at the first sign of injury. He employed physicians, often skilled ones, to mend broken bodies and keep them fighting. Here lies a paradox that shocks modern audiences. Men condemned to die were sometimes healed with greater attention than the poor citizens who filled the stands to watch them. The medical techniques available in Rome were crude by modern standards, yet they were surprisingly effective for their time. Surgeons could set broken bones with splints, stitch torn flesh with linen thread, and cauterize wounds to stop bleeding. Bronze and iron scalpels were sharp enough to open abscesses or extract arrows lodged in muscle. Herbal poultices made from honey, vinegar, or wine served as antiseptics, reducing infection in an age before antibiotics. Pain was dulled with opium or mandrake root, though sparingly, as the Romans valued endurance as a form of character. Some gladiators bore scars that testify to repeated care. Excavated skeletons show signs of healed fractures, broken arms, ribs, even skulls that had been repaired well enough for the fighter to return to combat. One skeleton from Ephesus reveals multiple healed injuries alongside newer ones, proof that the man had survived fight after fight, stitched back together only to be sent again into the arena. He was not expected to live forever, but he was expected to last long enough to profit his master. But care was not mercy. Treatment was functional, never compassionate. The lanista and his doctors focused on utility. Could this fighter be restored to usefulness? If yes, then every effort was made. If no, then the gladiator was discarded. This could mean abandonment to die of infection, or deliberate execution to remove the burden. A gladiator's body was a resource. When it could no longer yield spectacle, it ceased to matter. The psychological dimension of this medical world was just as important. To endure repeated wounds and recover again and again required not only physical healing but mental conditioning. Gladiators were taught to accept pain as part of their existence. The oath they swore upon entering the school, promising to endure burning, whipping, and the sword, was reinforced every time a doctor stitched their skin without anesthesia, every time a trainer forced them back into drills before a wound had fully closed. Pain was not a misfortune, it was proof of loyalty, a test of endurance, a rehearsal for the ultimate performance before the crowd. Some physicians who served in gladiator schools left behind writings that reveal this brutal world. Galen, perhaps the most famous doctor of antiquity, began his career tending to gladiators in Pergamum. He observed their injuries, practiced surgical techniques, and experimented with treatments on their battered bodies. What he learned there would later shape Roman medicine as a whole. In this way, the suffering of gladiators advanced medical knowledge that benefited the empire. Their pain was recycled into progress, their bodies laboratories of flesh and bone. But recovery was never complete. Every fighter carried the scars of past battles. Old wounds ached in cold weather. Nerves severed by cuts left fingers numb. Disfiguring scars traced across torsos and faces, marking them forever as men of the arena. To the public, these marks were symbols of bravery. Women adored them. Crowds marveled at them. But for the gladiators themselves, they were constant reminders of the cost of survival. The irony deepens when one considers how the wider Roman population accessed medicine. Poor citizens relied on home remedies, prayers to healing gods, or sheer endurance. A fractured arm in a laborer might mean permanent disability. An infected wound could lead to death within days. Meanwhile, inside the gladiator school, physicians tended wounds with method and skill, because their patience were investments. The despised gladiator, stripped of honor and freedom, might receive better treatment for a shattered bone than the free man who cheered for his suffering in the stands. Still, the medical world of gladiators was no paradise of healing. Amputation, when infection spread too far, was carried out with saws and without anesthesia. Burns were cauterized with hot iron. Teeth knocked loose were pulled rather than repaired. Survival often depended not only on the doctor's skill but on the fighter's sheer will to endure agony. Those who recovered became hardened, their tolerance for pain elevated beyond what most men could imagine. And so, gladiator medicine was both curse and advantage. It prolonged suffering while granting new chances at survival. It reminded fighters that their lives were not their own, yet it gave them tools to endure and fight again. The crowd saw only the surface, a man rising after a brutal strike, blood streaming down his face, ready to continue. They did not see the hidden hours afterward, the surgeons working by lamplight, the groans in the barracks, the wounds stitched and bandaged. They did not see the cycle of pain and repair that defined a gladiator's existence. In the end, the gladiator's body was both a spectacle and a laboratory, both a tool of entertainment and a site of suffering. Medicine preserved them not out of compassion but out of necessity. Their pain was measured, managed, and recycled into the next performance. And every scar, every healed bone, every stitched wound added to the mythology of the arena, proof that these men were more than ordinary, they were survivors, remade again and again in the crucible of blood and sand. To the Romans, gladiators were contradictions made flesh. They were despised as slaves, outcasts, and criminals, men stripped of honor and civic identity. Yet at the same time, they were idolized, adored, and elevated to a level of fame that few citizens could ever hope to achieve. In this strange paradox, gladiators lived lives of both degradation and glory. They were symbols of shame, yet also the superstars of their age. To understand this duality is to glimpse the unsettling complexity of Roman society, where violence and fame went hand in hand. On the one hand, gladiators were branded with infamia, a legal status that placed them among the most dishonorable groups in Roman culture, alongside prostitutes, actors, and executioners. They had no political rights, no social standing, and no respect in the eyes of the elite. A senator might sneer at them, a philosopher might condemn the games as corrupting spectacles, and a respectable family would never allow their daughter to openly marry one. They were men of the arena, tainted by blood. Yet despite this legal and social stigma, the reality of their public image was far more complicated. Walk through the streets of Pompeii before its destruction, and you would see proof of their fame scrawled on the walls. Graffiti celebrated favorite fighters, naming them with affection and admiration. Celadus the Thracian is the delight of the girls, reads one inscription, preserved to this day. Another proclaims, Crescens, the net fighter, holds the hearts of all the girls. These scribbles were the ancient equivalent of fan posters and celebrity gossip. To the women of Pompeii, these men were not dishonorable slaves, they were irresistible icons of strength and danger. The erotic allure of gladiators was powerful. Roman women, even from noble families, were drawn to them with a fascination that alarmed moralists. Juvenal, the satirist, mocked highborn women for sneaking into the gladiator schools to pursue affairs with fighters. One scandalous tale tells of Eppia, the wife of a senator, who abandoned her family to run away with a gladiator to Egypt. To Roman men of status, this was outrageous, that a woman would abandon wealth and power for a man branded with infamia, all because of the thrill of his scars and the scent of the arena. But it reveals the intensity of the fascination. Gladiators embodied a raw, dangerous masculinity that both frightened and enthralled. Fame extended beyond graffiti and gossip. Wealthy patrons sometimes sought out gladiators as personal bodyguards or companions, valuing not only their strength but the aura of fear they carried. Some gladiators were invited to private banquets, where they sat as curiosities, living ornaments of violence. Others were commissioned in art, mosaics depicting famous duels, frescoes showing their distinctive armor and weapons. In these depictions, gladiators became larger than life, their identities preserved in the very homes of those who watched them fight. There were even merchandising opportunities. Souvenirs bearing the likeness of gladiators circulated among the fans. Oil lamps, cups, and small figurines were decorated with images of favorite fighters. To own such an item was to declare loyalty, much as modern sports fans wear the jerseys of their heroes. The games themselves became platforms for marketing. Fighters who impressed the crowd could become household names, discussed in taverns, debated in forums, idolized in whispers. And yet, the paradox persisted. Fame did not erase their chains. Gladiators remained bound by contracts, slaves to their lanista, prisoners of the ludus. A star fighter might be cheered in the arena one day, then flogged by his master the next. His name might be celebrated in graffiti, but in law he was still a man of infamia, denied the rights of citizenship. This dual identity, idolized by the crowd yet despised by the elite, was part of what made them so magnetic. They were dangerous, transgressive, thrilling precisely because they crossed the boundaries of Roman respectability. Some gladiators achieved fame so great that their names traveled beyond their city. Flamma, a Syrian-born fighter, won the hearts of Roman audiences in the 2nd century. He was offered freedom 4 times and refused it each time, choosing instead to remain in the arena where his glory was greatest. To the Romans, his choice was both shocking and admirable, a man who preferred the roar of the crowd and the certainty of fame to the quiet obscurity of freedom. His story became legend, and his name was remembered long after his death. Gladiators also became entangled in politics. Ambitious men seeking power knew the games could win them favor with the masses, and famous fighters were central to this strategy. Politicians sponsored lavish spectacles, hiring the best gladiators to perform, knowing that the crowd's adoration could translate into political loyalty. In this way, gladiators became pawns not only of their lanisti but also of Rome's ruling class. Their fame was exploited, their performances turned into political currency. But for the gladiators themselves, fame could be a double-edged sword. It offered the possibility of privileges, better food, more comfortable quarters, even money earned from wealthy admirers. Some fighters became so celebrated that their masters rented them out for appearances, charging high fees for private performances. A handful even grew rich, accumulating wealth that, though never quite erasing their infamia, gave them power unusual for men of their station. Yet fame also meant danger. A famous gladiator was expected to deliver greater spectacle. The crowd demanded courage, skill, and blood. To falter was to risk not only humiliation but death, as disappointed audiences called for execution. The celebrity of gladiators reveals something profound about Roman society. It was a world where violence was entertainment, where the boundary between shame and glory was paper-thin, and where fame could elevate even the most dishonorable into objects of worship. The people adored gladiators not despite their blood-soaked existence but because of it. Their scars were not disfigurements but badges of honor, proof of survival in a brutal world. Their very degradation, transformed by spectacle, became their allure. In the amphitheater, the paradox reached its climax. When a gladiator entered the arena, the crowd did not see a slave. They saw a hero, a performer, a living symbol of courage and strength. They screamed his name, prayed for his victory, and begged for his survival. In that moment, he was more than a man. He was an icon, as famous in his world as any modern athlete or movie star in ours. And yet, when the fight was over and the crowd dispersed, he returned to the chains of his barracks, reminded that his fame was both his power and his prison. The gladiator as celebrity stands as one of the strangest contradictions of Rome. To be loved and despised, honored and degraded, cheered and chained, this was the fate of men who lived and died for the crowd. Their legacy remains carved into walls, painted in frescoes, whispered in satire, and remembered in legend. And though centuries have passed, their paradox still fascinates: the slaves who became stars, the outcasts who became idols, the condemned who lived like gods in the eyes of the people. Death was the ever-present shadow of the gladiator's life. It loomed behind every match, every cheer, every clash of steel. For the crowd, it was the climax they awaited, the moment of blood that transformed combat into spectacle. For the gladiator, it was both a constant threat and an intimate companion. To understand the rituals and realities of death in the arena is to see how Rome transformed mortality into theater, and how the empire itself was bound together by a fascination with blood. To modern minds, it may seem that every fight ended with slaughter, but the reality was more nuanced. Not every bout was a death sentence. Training a gladiator was expensive, and no lanista wanted to waste a valuable investment unnecessarily. Many duels ended when one fighter was clearly overpowered or incapacitated, and the defeated raised a finger, the signal of surrender. At that moment, the crowd's role became crucial. Their reaction could determine whether the man lived or died. Survival depended not only on skill in battle, but also on charisma, reputation, and the fickle mercy of thousands of strangers. The decision of life or death was usually symbolized by the emperor or the editor of the games, but it was guided by the crowd's voice. A defeated gladiator might kneel, waiting, as the amphitheater roared. If the crowd believed he had fought bravely, they might shout for mercy. If they deemed him cowardly, or hungered for blood, they demanded execution. The editor would then make the final gesture. Thumb signals are debated by historians, but whatever form they took, the decision was absolute. One motion of the hand sealed a man's fate. When death was chosen, it was not chaos but ritual. The victorious gladiator was expected to deliver the final blow with precision, striking to the chest or neck to end the suffering quickly. The defeated was expected to accept his fate without begging or panic, meeting death with dignity. This, too, was part of the performance. To die well was to prove oneself a true gladiator, to embody Roman ideals of courage and endurance even in the face of annihilation. A death without honor shamed not only the fighter but the school that trained him. Yet no matter how ritualized, the brutality was undeniable. The sand of the arena was soaked again and again with blood. Ancient writers described the way attendants raked the sand between fights, covering the stains of death so the next bout could begin on a clean surface. Bodies were dragged away through hidden gates, sometimes still twitching with life, sometimes already lifeless. The amphitheater was a machine for consuming men, transforming their suffering into entertainment. Behind the pageantry lay a cold economic truth: gladiators were commodities, and their deaths were part of the spectacle's price. Sometimes, editors deliberately demanded blood to please the crowd, especially in lavish games where extravagance was a show of power. Executions of condemned criminals were staged as gladiatorial, warm-up acts, with men forced to fight wild beasts or reenact myths ending in gruesome deaths. These executions blurred into the world of gladiators, reinforcing the message that Rome's power over life and death was absolute. But while the crowd screamed for blood, not all Romans approved. Philosophers like Seneca criticized the games for degrading both fighters and spectators, arguing that the lust for death corrupted the soul. Yet such voices were drowned out by the popularity of the spectacles. For the majority, death was not only acceptable, it was essential. Watching men face mortality reminded Romans of their own values: bravery, honor, discipline. The amphitheater became a place where death itself was transformed into a moral lesson and a patriotic ritual. The paradox is striking. Death in the arena was both very real and strangely theatrical. The gladiator's agony was genuine, his blood true, his end final. And yet the spectacle framed it as performance, an art of dying that reinforced cultural ideals. The gladiator's final breath was part of the script, expected to be delivered with stoic acceptance. In this way, even in his death, the gladiator served the audience, embodying virtues they admired but would never wish to endure themselves. The rituals extended beyond the fight. Once a gladiator was killed, his body was dragged from the arena by attendants dressed as the god Mercury, guide of souls, while another dressed as Charon, ferryman of the dead, struck the corpse with a mallet to ensure he was truly lifeless. This macabre pantomime transformed slaughter into ritual, linking the death to Roman religion and myth. Even in his final moment, the gladiator was both man and symbol, both victim and performer in a drama larger than himself. For the survivors, each death carried meaning. To fight alongside men who had died bravely created a culture of respect within the gladiator schools. Fallen comrades were remembered not only as victims but as models of courage. Their names might be carved into walls, their victories recalled in conversation, their final stands whispered with awe. In this way, death in the arena was not an ending but a continuation of fame, a passage from the barracks into legend. Archaeology preserves traces of these endings. Skeletons from gladiatorial cemeteries show precise wounds, often to the skull, consistent with death blows delivered in the arena. Some bear signs of ritual dispatch, sharp blades penetrating bone in ways too deliberate to be random. These remains are silent testimonies of the final act, proof that the rituals described in texts were carried out in blood and bone. They remind us that behind every story of the games lay real human suffering, real pain, real lives extinguished for spectacle. For the Romans, however, death in the arena was not merely cruelty, it was a reaffirmation of values. To watch a man fight and die was to witness courage, to feel the pulse of Rome's greatness, to be reminded of the empire's power over life itself. Death was entertainment, but it was also ideology. The arena was a mirror of Rome, brutal, disciplined, relentless, and magnificent. And for the gladiators themselves? Death was not just an end but an inevitability. Some met it early, others delayed it for years, but all knew it was waiting. To step into the arena was to gamble with mortality every time. To survive was temporary. To die well was eternal. For the gladiator, death in the arena was not failure, it was fulfillment of the oath he had sworn, the final act in the brutal theater that defined his existence. When the crowd roared for the next fight and the sand was raked clean, the dead gladiator seemed to vanish into the machinery of spectacle. Yet beyond the arena gates, his story did not simply end. The aftermath of a gladiator's death, his burial, his memory, the traces he left behind, reveals another side of this world, one both intimate and haunting. It shows how men who were condemned as slaves could be remembered as heroes, how their lives lingered in inscriptions, graves, and whispered stories long after their bodies had been carried away. The Romans were a people obsessed with ritual, and death was no exception. For ordinary citizens, funerals were vital moments of family honor. But gladiators, men branded with infamia, did not automatically enjoy the same dignity. Many were buried hastily, their remains carried out of the amphitheater through a special gate known as the Porta Libidinensis, the Gate of Death. From there, attendants disposed of the bodies, often with little ceremony. For some, especially criminals forced into the arena, there was no grave, only a ditch or mass pit. In these cases, memory was deliberately erased, the man reduced to anonymity in both life and death. Yet gladiators occupied a peculiar position. Though legally dishonored, they often inspired fierce loyalty from their fellow fighters, their trainers, and even the public. Evidence from inscriptions tells us that gladiatorial communities sometimes banded together to bury their fallen comrades with care. Burial clubs, or collegia, existed to ensure that even the lowliest fighters received rites. Contributions from fellow gladiators paid for tombs, headstones, or small memorials. For men who had been torn from their families and stripped of status, this substitute kinship offered a final dignity. Some tombstones survive to this day, etched with words that reveal both the brutality of their lives and the affection they inspired. One epitaph from Rome commemorates a gladiator named Urbicus, dead at 22 after 13 bouts. It records his victories, his age, and the sorrow of his companions. Another, from Pompeii, describes a fighter named Celadus, celebrated in graffiti as the darling of the girls. Such inscriptions transformed gladiators into remembered individuals, not just anonymous victims of the games. Their short lives, cut down in violence, were immortalized in stone. There is something deeply human in these memorials. They speak not of slaves or criminals but of men who earned respect in the harshest of arenas. Comrades called them brothers. Women adorned their tombs with flowers. Fans carved their names into walls. In death, they transcended the legal stain of infamia. Memory lifted them higher than law allowed, granting them a form of immortality denied in life. The funerary rituals themselves could be striking. Some gladiators were buried with offerings of oil lamps, coins, or figurines, symbols to light their journey into the afterlife. Others were honored with carved reliefs showing them in armor, forever preserved as fighters in stone. These images, more than simple decoration, proclaimed their identity with pride. To be remembered as a gladiator was not shameful to those who loved them, it was a badge of courage, proof of struggle and endurance. Yet not all were remembered kindly. For some, death erased them entirely. Lanisti, eager to avoid costs, might refuse burial for less valuable fighters, leaving their corpses to be discarded without rites. Enemies within the barracks might neglect to honor a man who had been despised. Roman elites, when they spoke of gladiators, often reduced their memory to satire or condemnation, using their deaths as moral lessons in decadence. The contrast is sharp, adored by fans, forgotten by masters, mocked by elites. Memory itself was as divided as their lives had been. Archaeology sheds further light on this complex legacy. Excavations in Ephesus revealed a gladiatorial cemetery containing dozens of skeletons. Many bore signs of violent deaths, deep cuts, fatal skull injuries, puncture wounds from blades. Yet the burials were orderly, with care taken to arrange the bodies, suggesting that comrades ensured they were not left discarded. In one case, analysis showed that two fighters had died from nearly identical wounds, hinting at a duel fought to the death. Their graves, side by side, testify not only to the violence of their end but to the respect shown in burial. Other cemeteries reveal a blend of brutality and tenderness. Some skeletons show signs of healed injuries, evidence of medical care and long careers, followed by deliberate interment after death. Grave goods, such as pottery or personal trinkets, suggest that even in their marginal status, gladiators were mourned. Their communities refused to let them vanish into anonymity. Instead, they built small worlds of remembrance, where men who lived and died in spectacle could still rest as individuals. The memory of gladiators extended beyond their graves. Stories circulated, legends grew, and names endured. A fighter who died bravely might be immortalized in poems or songs. Children might repeat tales of a duel, exaggerating the courage of their favorite. In this way, memory transformed the dead into heroes larger than life. Their deaths, though violent and cruel, became part of Rome's cultural fabric, woven into its identity as surely as its victories and conquests. Even centuries later, echoes of their memory remain. The graffiti of Pompeii still shouts their names. Tombstones still proclaim their courage. Archaeological remains still whisper of the care taken to bury them. These fragments remind us that behind the brutality of the games were real men, remembered with love and sorrow by those who knew them. Their humanity survived the arena's attempt to reduce them to spectacle. And yet, memory was fragile. For every gladiator whose name survives, countless more are lost. Their bones lie in unmarked graves, their stories silenced forever. They were consumed by the amphitheater's hunger, forgotten once their bodies were carried through the gate of death. This silence is as much a part of their legacy as the inscriptions that remain. It reminds us that fame and memory were privileges, not guarantees. The aftermath of a gladiator's death reveals Rome's contradictions in full. A man condemned as dishonorable might receive a funeral that honored him as a hero. A slave might be mourned like family. A fighter mocked by philosophers might be immortalized in graffiti as the darling of the crowd. In life, the gladiator was spectacle. In death, he became memory. And though Rome has long since fallen, those memories, etched in stone and preserved in ruins, still speak to us across the centuries, testimonies of lives lived in blood, courage, and the desperate hope of being remembered. If the amphitheater was a theater of blood, then behind its curtains stood an empire of money. Gladiators may have been slaves, criminals, and outcasts, but their world was built on a foundation of coin, contracts, and careful calculation. Every strike of the sword and every drop of blood spilled had a price. To understand the business of gladiators is to see Rome not only as a society of violence but as a machine of profit, where death itself could be bought, sold, and balanced in the ledger. The costs of staging a gladiatorial spectacle were immense. The construction of amphitheaters like the Colosseum required fortunes in stone, labor, and engineering. But even the daily operation of smaller arenas demanded constant investment. Gladiators had to be purchased, trained, housed, and fed. Physicians, trainers, and guards required payment. Armor and weapons needed maintenance. When the games arrived, additional costs appeared: musicians, animal handlers, costumed attendants, and the endless labor of preparing the sand for the blood it would soon drink. For the man sponsoring the games, the editor, every fight was an exercise in calculated extravagance. Editors rarely hosted spectacles out of generosity. They were politicians, ambitious nobles, or emperors seeking the loyalty of the people. By sponsoring gladiatorial games, they displayed their wealth, their power, and their supposed generosity toward the public. The crowd might leave with their bellies full of free grain or their eyes dazzled by extravagant bloodshed, but behind the scenes, every coin spent was an investment in political capital. A successful spectacle could turn a mediocre politician into a popular hero. A disappointing one could ruin reputations. Blood, for Rome, was currency in more ways than one. At the heart of this economy were the gladiators themselves, human investments carefully managed by their lanisti, the owners of gladiatorial schools. Purchasing a fighter was not cheap. Some were condemned criminals, obtained at little cost, but others were volunteers or prisoners of war bought for high prices. Training them required months of food, lodging, and instruction, with no guarantee of survival. A lanista had to gamble constantly. Would his investment pay off in victories, in fame, in lucrative contracts to loan his fighters to editors? Or would the man die in his first fight, leaving nothing but debts and wasted expenses? To mitigate risk, lanisti sometimes created contracts with editors that offered gladiators for rental rather than outright sale. In this arrangement, the editor paid for the performance, but the lanista retained ownership of the fighter. If the gladiator survived, he could fight again, generating profit multiple times. If he died, the contract might include a penalty payment to cover the loss. This financial system reveals how coldly pragmatic the trade was. A man's life could be calculated into columns of numbers, his worth expressed in coin, his death an economic inconvenience. The economics extended to betting, one of the most vibrant aspects of gladiatorial games. Crowds wagered heavily on outcomes, turning the amphitheater into a marketplace of risk and reward. Romans loved to gamble, and gladiators provided endless opportunities. Odds shifted with reputations, injuries, and whispers of skill. Money flowed through taverns and markets before a major bout, fortunes changing hands as fighters faced one another. For some gladiators, betting even became part of their income, as sympathetic spectators rewarded them for victories. The arena was both battlefield and casino, where blood fueled an economy of chance. Even the dead contributed to the business. After fights, armor and weapons were collected, cleaned, and reused. Fallen fighters were stripped of their gear, which could be rented out to the next man. Bodies were disposed of through contracts with burial clubs or public undertakers, who themselves profited from Rome's endless appetite for spectacle. Death was not waste, it was an industry, with every stage of the process offering someone an opportunity for profit. Merchandising also played its part. Just as modern fans buy jerseys or posters, Roman spectators purchased souvenirs of their favorite gladiators. Oil lamps, pottery, and figurines bore the likenesses of famous fighters. Some even collected vials of blood or fragments of weapons as charms believed to bring strength and fertility. The boundary between religion, superstition, and commerce blurred, as the economy of blood reached into the personal lives of fans. A gladiator was not just a fighter, he was a brand, his image commodified for profit long after he left the arena floor. For emperors, the business of the games was even more strategic. The Colosseum itself was funded by the spoils of conquest, built in part with wealth seized from Judea after Rome crushed the Jewish revolt. Emperors understood that spectacles were investments in stability. By entertaining the masses, they curbed unrest. By dazzling them with extravagance, they advertised Rome's glory. By spending freely, they demonstrated imperial generosity. Bread and circuses, as the satirist Juvenal put it, were the twin currencies of power. Gladiators were therefore not only commodities but also tools of empire, their struggles woven into the very fabric of political control. But for the gladiators themselves, the economics of the games were a double-edged sword. A victorious fighter could earn rewards, money, gifts, even the adoration of wealthy patrons. Some gladiators accumulated modest fortunes, stored away in hopes of buying freedom. Others received gifts of silver or gold crowns, tokens of both honor and financial worth. Yet these rewards always came with risk, for the next match might end it all. The economics of survival were brutal, profit and death were never far apart. The entire system reveals the stark logic of Rome. Gladiators were not simply men, they were investments, assets, and revenue streams. Their bodies generated profit in life and in death, in combat and in memory, in spectacle and in souvenir. The games were not only theaters of violence but businesses of blood, sustained by the coin of politicians, the wagers of fans, the contracts of lanistae, and the endless demand of the Roman people for spectacle. And at the heart of it all was a chilling truth: the gladiator's worth was always conditional. He was valued not for who he was, but for what he could generate: excitement, fame, profit. The moment he ceased to produce, whether through defeat or death, his value ended. In this way, the economics of gladiators strip away the glamour and reveal the raw core of the system: men reduced to currency, human lives transformed into numbers in a marketplace of blood. The arena may have defined a gladiator's fame, but it did not define every waking moment of his life. Beyond the sand and steel lay the hours between fights, the quieter spaces that reveal another side of their existence. This was the hidden world of gladiators, a life lived in barracks, in training yards, in stolen moments of pleasure or despair. To glimpse these daily realities is to step behind the curtain of spectacle and see the men not as icons of blood, but as human beings navigating a life both ordinary and extraordinary. A gladiator's day began not with cheers but with discipline. Inside the ludus, the gladiator school, the schedule was relentless. The morning brought drills with wooden weapons, sparring sessions under the eyes of trainers, and endless repetition of footwork. Meals followed, carefully controlled by dietitians who ensured the fighters consumed the high-energy, starchy foods that kept their bodies fueled. Afterward came more practice, conditioning exercises, or the maintenance of weapons and armor. The arena might be a theater of violence, but preparation for it was monotonous, a routine closer to military life than to chaos. Outside these barracks, though, gladiators sometimes found surprising freedoms. Those who performed well could be allowed to visit taverns, mingle in markets, or even attend public banquets. In these settings, they encountered fans eager to speak to them, touch them, or offer favors. Women, in particular, were fascinated, and some gladiators took full advantage. Scandals abound in ancient texts of women from wealthy families pursuing affairs with fighters. What shocked Roman elites as disgraceful was, for the gladiators, a chance at intimacy, status, and sometimes even financial gifts. The man who was scorned as dishonorable in law might be adored in private as irresistible. The everyday life of gladiators also intersected with religion. Many turned to cults and gods who promised protection in battle. Shrines within the ludus bore images of deities like Nemesis, the goddess of fate and retribution, and Hercules, the hero of strength. Fighters prayed before matches, left offerings of food or incense, and sought divine favor for survival. In these rituals, the gladiator's life echoed that of ordinary Romans, faith as a shield against uncertainty, prayer as a weapon against fear. But superstition reached further still. Some gladiators carried charms, amulets, or tokens given by admirers, believed to bring luck in combat. Bones of animals, carved figurines, even lockets of hair were treasured as talismans. The line between religion, magic, and psychology blurred. When survival depended on chance as much as skill, even the smallest charm could feel like a lifeline. Entertainment was another thread in their daily existence. Fighters sang, told stories, played dice games, or gambled during downtime. In these moments, the camaraderie of the barracks was strongest. Rivalry certainly existed. After all, comrades might one day face each other in the arena, but bonds of brotherhood were equally powerful. They trained together, bled together, and sometimes died together. The barracks could be brutal, but they could also be a family forged in violence. Not all moments were joyful. Discipline was strict, and punishments severe. Those who disobeyed trainers or attempted escape could be flogged, chained, or even executed. Guards patrolled the schools, ensuring the valuable investments of the lanista did not slip away. For many gladiators, life outside the arena was simply another form of imprisonment. The bars were different, the chains looser, but the lack of freedom was constant. And yet, some gladiators found ways to create lives for themselves beyond the barracks. Inscriptions suggest that a few even married or fathered children. Others used prize money to support families or purchase property, laying small foundations for futures they might never live to see. These glimpses remind us that gladiators were not merely creatures of the arena but men who clung to ordinary hopes, love, family, stability. For some, the dream of manumission, freedom, was the light that guided them through the darkness. The city around them reminded them constantly of their paradoxical status. In the marketplace, they might be hailed as heroes, but they could also be insulted as dishonorable. In taverns, they were magnets for attention but also for resentment. To live as a gladiator outside the arena was to carry both fame and stigma in equal measure. Every interaction bore the weight of their reputation, every glance a reminder that they were both adored and despised. Archaeology offers hints of these hidden realities. In Pompeii, graffiti shows ordinary citizens debating the merits of different fighters, naming them like modern sports fans might argue over rival athletes. To walk through such streets as a gladiator was to live within one's own legend, to see one's name scrawled on walls, to hear whispers of admiration or mockery. Fame followed them everywhere, shaping even their most mundane activities. And then there were the moments of silence, the hours between training and fighting, when the noise of the crowd was absent. What did gladiators think in those times? Did they dream of escape, of freedom, of life beyond the arena? Or did they accept their fate, resigned to live and die within the sands? Ancient texts give only fragments. Some embraced their role fully, becoming proud of their scars and victories. Others tried to flee, gambling on desperate escapes that often ended in death. For most, the truth lay somewhere in between, a daily negotiation with fate, lived one routine, one prayer, one dice game at a time. Everyday life outside the arena shows us the gladiator not as an abstract symbol of Roman violence but as a man of contradictions. He was disciplined like a soldier but imprisoned like a slave. He was adored like a hero but shamed like an outcast. He lived in barracks that felt like both family and cage. He sought meaning in gods, charms, or gambling, finding small freedoms within the walls that confined him. His days were ordinary in their routines yet extraordinary in their stakes. In these hidden realities, we see the humanity of the gladiators most clearly. They were not only fighters on display but men trying to live, endure, and carve small pieces of identity in a world that commodified them. Their daily lives remind us that behind the spectacle, behind the blood, behind the cheering of the crowd, were people caught between despair and hope, brutality and brotherhood, chains and fleeting freedoms. It was this tension, the mixture of the ordinary and the extraordinary, that made the life of a gladiator so haunting, so paradoxical, and so unforgettable.